مساء الخير وأهلا وسهلا بكم في حوار جديد مع المنصة. معانا النهاردة دكتورة أناليس دي فريز، أستاذة التاريخ بجامعة سانفورد بالولايات المتحدة. المتابع لأحوال المعادي يلاحظ انتشار بوستات ومقالات صحفية كتير بتحذر بشدة من ظاهرة قطع الأشجار. يمكن نقدر نفهم أكتر قلق سكان المعادي لو رجعنا وشفنا الدعاية اللي كانت معمولة للحي في بداية إنشائه، واللي كانت بتوصفه بأنه أشبه بواحة خضراء وسط صحراء يطغى عليها اللون الأصفر. في كتابها الصادر سنة 2021 عن الجامعة الأمريكية بالقاهرة، حاولت الدكتورة أناليز إنها تبحر في تاريخ إنشاء حي المعادي وتبحث عن الشخصية المعمارية الأصيلة اللي كان منشئو المعادي بيحلموا بأنهم يأسسوها، واللي استمرت مع الحي لعقود بعد إنشائه. يمكن من خلال تتبع الرحلة دي نقدر نفهم قلق سكان المعادي وسكان أحياء تانية قديمة زي مصر الجديدة والزمالك من التغيرات العمرانية الكبيرة اللي بتحصل في الأحياء دي هذه الأيام تحت دعاوى التطوير. حوالين الشخصية الأصيلة للمعادي هيكون حوارنا النهاردة مع دكتورة أناليس. Thank you doctor for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
في البداية أنا كنت حابب أسألك أكتر عن الشيء الأصيل اللي أنت لمستيه في شخصية المعادي وقت إنشائها، المكون الأساسي أو التصور المعماري الأساسي اللي الناس اللي عملت المعادي كانوا متخيلين إن الحي هيكون عليه بعد إنشائه، واللي يمكن يكون إداك الحافز إن أنت تألفي الكتاب الخاص، الكتاب اللي أصدرتيه عن تاريخ المعادي.
So Maadi was envisioned as a real estate development to complement the light rail line that a sister company built from Cairo to Hawan. So the Egyptian Delta Light Railways Company wanted to develop land along the rail line in order to turn a profit. But some of the founders of that company really envisioned a kind of idyllic community, and they founded a separate company then called the Egyptian Delta Land and Investment Company. In my book, I just call it Delta Land. That's usually what they called themselves. But they developed other parts of the Delta, but then Maadi became their biggest and most signature project. And the vision was really kind of surprisingly adopted from a city planning or suburban planning idea called a garden city that came from England, but the guy who had the idea for it, he was actually inspired by the redevelopment of Chicago after the Great Chicago Fire. So it's really a global trend in suburban design. And the idea was that this was supposed to be an idyllic community outside of the pollution of a downtown urban center, but because knowing that you would still need people who would work in the city, it would be connected to the city by a rail line. It would have only one central commercial district. So that's Sharia Tisa, the Road 9, as that central commercial place. That's the only place you're supposed to have businesses. And then outside of that was all residential space. And then beyond that residential space, it was supposed to have a completely undeveloped berm or like an agricultural or rural buffer. And that was supposed to insulate the community sort of and keep it within sort of a bubble. I think part of what gave Maadi its distinctions, and a lot of longtime residents, when I was doing my research, talked about Maadi this way, was that Maadi had rules. So if you wanted a home in Maadi, you had certain limits on like how tall your home could be. You couldn't build like large skyrise apartments or even like beyond 2 or 3 story homes. You had to have a large garden surrounding it. You had to have, you couldn't have a wall that obstructed the view of the house to the garden. You could only have it like a waist high sort of perimeter. And so those rules ensured that, for one, you had to be very wealthy to build a home there. But then there was just this real beauty to all of the gardens. And they're lush. The homes were beautiful. And that was the original vision for Maadi. And it maintained sort of within that structure, well, largely up until World War II. So it's about the first 40 or so years of its existence.
So it was mainly made for foreigner residents or Egyptian residents?
It was initially made to appeal to foreigners because, but it wasn't exclusively for foreigners. So there were a lot of, so a lot of British, French residents, people who are mostly involved in business, less so people who are just involved in government. But then there were a lot of Egyptian Jews who had homes there initially. And increasingly, especially into the 1920s, you saw a lot more Egyptians moving into.
But actually, who can live in this bubble, or a fantastic bubble of Maadi, must be from high classes in Egypt.
Yeah, you're really like, so they, the people who could really afford to live there had, they were, I would describe them as like very upper middle class. They were a lot of professionals still, but sort of, the aesthetic appeal wasn't unlike Beta Uma, the Sadzadlul's house, which is closer to the city, but it was a similar kind of ideal. So he was a lawyer. So you did see it like Egyptian professionals moving in, but they had to be very wealthy.
يعني حضرتك برضو أشرت في الكتاب بشكل أساسي للتكوين المتنوع لسكان المعادي، واللي زي ما كان في أجانب في مصريين، وكان في إشارات كتير قوي في الكتاب لفكرة وجود رموز سياسية حتى مهمة من الحركة الوطنية المصرية في حي المعادي في الوقت ده، على عكس الاعتقاد الشائع ممكن انه يعني دي طبقة من الأثرياء الميالين أكتر للتحالف مع الاستعمار يعني في هذا الوقت. فلو حضرتك ممكن توضح لنا أكتر طبيعة الشخصيات السياسية المهمة اللي كانت موجودة في المعادي في هذا الوقت.
So one of the things I found very interesting in studying Maadi's history was that I think because it was such an economic development, it was a profit-seeking venture. It actually, the nationalist figures who end up there are also very invested in Egypt's economic freedoms. So there are a number of different Egyptians who live in Maadi who embrace the nationalist cause. They're often referred to broadly as the Effendiya, the middle class intelligentsia. And several of them end up on the board of the Delta Land Company. One of the most prominent nationalists, and he actually for a long time had a street named after him, was Ahmed Abdel Wahid Pasha. And following the 1919 revolution, he was Minister of Finance for 3 different prime ministers. He was most heavily associated with Ismail Sidki, whose government rewrote the Egyptian constitution in 1930. Sidki is a fairly controversial figure. He was kind of arguably he was fascist. He does not embrace like liberal reforms. He's anti-Waft. But one of the things that Sidki and Abdul Wahab really pushed hard for was Egypt's financial independence. Part of the reason Maadi could exist as a business venture was because of certain foreign policies, foreign arrangements, the capitulations. These are like century-old Ottoman economic policies that meant that foreigners did not have to pay taxes. They essentially got diplomatic privileges. And in Egypt, because Egypt becomes this massive hub for international trade, different foreign governments basically secure the capitulations that they get to stick around for until 1949. So, by that point, the Ottoman Empire is long gone. But in Egypt, foreigners aren't paying taxes. They have all these other diplomatic privileges, and it deeply hurt local Egyptian economic development. So Abdelwahid was one of the leading voices in opposing the capitulation, and he threatened publicly and privately to unilaterally just withdraw from them. I think his presence in Maadi really shows how there was a class of Egyptians who embraced the beauty of Maadi. I think in some ways that the gardens of Maadi showed the natural beauty of the greater Cairo area in a way that nationalists could really embrace and love and see as a symbol of the beauty of their country. And he was one who really envisioned that as something Egyptians should hold on to and could exist apart from all of this foreign privilege. He was instrumental in getting an end to the capitulations diplomatically, and they got an agreement to end them in 1937, but they had to agree to a 12-year transition period, which is why they didn't end until 1949. He died unexpectedly, probably of the flu, in 1939. So he never saw the end of them. He never saw sort of the fruits of those labors. And to me, he really is emblematic of the kind of vision that a lot of Egyptians had in the 1930s and 40s of an independent Egypt that could still maintain itself as a hub of international trade, that could hold on to some of the beautiful things that were produced when Egypt didn't have that kind of financial. And that story of the capitulations is in many ways like the economic backstory of Maadi. Once the capitulations end, Maadi's entire society transformed.
إلى أي مدى يعني ساهمت حقبة ما بعد الحرب العالمية الثانية في تغيير شكل الحياة في المعادي؟
After World War II, Maadi society changed dramatically. Between 1945 up to 49, Europeans began leaving in anticipation of losing those economic benefits that they had from the capitulations. And then Egypt also passed a new company law in 1947 that reduced the number of foreigners a business could employ. At that point, the Delta Land Company had to drastically start overhauling its leadership. They put in a new board, and that new board was less invested in the earlier garden city design principles that Maadi was founded on. But this shift was, I would argue, very understandable. The company needed to find new sources of revenue with so many wealthy foreigners leaving Egypt. So at the end of World War II, Delta Land's board began making plans to develop that berm area, that agricultural buffer that surrounded Maadi, and this led to the development of both Hidayak Maadi and Digla. Hidayak was much more immediately profitable than Digla. They had a lot of issues excavating Digla in order to build there. But in Hidayak, the company began building larger and taller apartment buildings there that could house a more true sort of middle class. So a lot of doctors, lawyers, who couldn't afford the large villas in the older part of Maadi. And they were still drawn to that suburban environment. This made a lot of business sense. This was a much larger market for them than the kind of wealthy foreigners who had lived in Maadi for the first 40 years. So while the development of the berm seemed very regrettable to a lot of long-term Maadi residents, at the same time, it was arguably a fairly sound business decision. And it's at this point that the older part of Maadi gets the name Maadi Sayarat, the Maadi of the palaces, because the addition of Hidayak made Maadi, like that older part, more distinct in comparison to the newer areas. So the founders of Maadi would not have wanted to develop something like Hidayat, but even just the demographic pressures on Cairo at the time, you have just a large influx of people coming in. It's so much internal migration that to not develop that land, I don't think was a viable option. And for the company to survive, they were in a bit of a desperate situation. And so I think you also then see certain like villas turned into apartments, sort of broken up, which is what happens to a lot of villas now. They're broken up into still very large apartments.
بالانتقال للحقبة الناصرية أعتقد يعني إنه كان في إحساس عام في المجتمع بإنه الناس يعني استعادت ملكية الحي ده من خلال الإجراءات الكتير اللي حصلت في الفترة دي لتحرير الخدمات الاجتماعية وجعلها يعني أكثر انفتاحا على حزمة على طبقات أكبر بكتير من اللي كانت تقتصر عليها فيما قبل حقبة ثورة يوليو. فحضرتك تشرح لنا أكتر عن التغييرات الاجتماعية اللي حصلت في الحقبة الناصرية.
So Nasser's reforms initially and were seen really positively by a lot of longtime Maadi residents. Actually, his nationalization projects and socialization or projects hit Delta land directly in 1962. And that's when the company that ran Maadi is absorbed by the Egyptian state. My book ends at that point because it's such a huge turning point in Maadi's history, and the book would have been like twice as long had I kind of had to carry forward. That said, by the time that Maadi is fully nationalized, and I would argue that from 1952 to 1962, those 10 years under Nasser, there's a lot of optimism amongst many Egyptian residents, and then some quick disappointments. Several of the Egyptian residents of Maadi were large agricultural landholders. So they lose, because of his land reforms, they lose their property and their assets. So you see a kind of scrambling after the actual policies under Nasser start unfolding. And this is all before the company disappears. So it's interesting. This isn't this as that happens, you see families kind of like break up. Some family, like with some folks who stay in Egypt for the rest of their lives, some go to the United States, some go to Europe. And there's sort of like just a diffusion of that older class of Maadi residents who might go in all sorts of different directions. In terms of what that like the social impact and the inclusion of other social classes, that does start to unfold already. Some of that has already unfolded because of policies put in place by Delta Land before the company's nationalized. And so Maadi is already sort of opening up, and this just accelerates that. There is a lot of pushback then amongst those older residents who want to see the rules of Maadi preserved. And so they form their own neighborhood association and put in place a lot of rules about how you're supposed to maintain your yard, especially rules about like noise, cars, things that ultimately they can't control. And so once Maadi is incorporated really into the Egyptian state, then there's a real intense attempt to preserve elements of Maadi's exclusivity, but they ultimately fail. So they are reacting to the social changes around them, and they're trying to preserve. And I don't know that they see themselves as like opposed to a more inclusive Maadi. They just want that. They want new social classes integrated into Maadi on certain terms. So they have a list of rules that are published in English and in Arabic about like who is the person, the resident of Maadi. And then it lays out like sort of the do's and don'ts. And this was published by this neighborhood organization that forms in the late 50s into the 60s. I think that they don't necessarily see the immense wealth and privilege attached to maintaining those rules. Mm-hmm. And so while it's not that, so the idea that everyone who came there, regardless of social class or background, would maintain those rules was very idealistic. I think that Maadi, in its sort of center, has always been a place kind of profit driven in different and competing ways. So even as like it opened up, so you might see families where the siblings inherit like a beautiful villa. And you might have some of the siblings who want to see that preserved, but maintaining a home that size as the economic situation in Egypt is very rapidly changing, becomes very difficult. And so then you have other siblings who want to see it turned into an apartment building. I mean, you just get all sorts of other investors and other interests that get poured into Maadi. And all of those competing interests make the maintenance of that older system very difficult. And I think people become very attached to the sense of what Maadi was. And understandably, this is a beautiful place and a special place. And but cities are some amazing hybrid of sort of machine and organic being that they are constantly changing. And so the social pressures on Maadi were profound, but in some ways it's the social changes that motivate new economic interests that ultimately see the dismantling from the inside and the outside of what Maadi was before. It's interesting because like this is the same time period where like New York gets highways, like large interstate highways built through Black neighborhoods. So you're seeing a lot of, in other cities, you're seeing around the world a lot of top-down planning that actually really hurts like minorities and lower classes. So that this is so comparatively, I don't know. Like, I do think that it was idealistic to try to maintain those rules and think and imagine that it sort of comes out of turning a blind eye to the incredible demographic pressures that were being put on Cairo by that point and have continued to be put on Cairo since then. It is interesting. There were some pushes by other, I would argue, somewhat idealistic planners to have different kinds of housing. But at that point, Maadi has no central governance. There's nothing leading Maadi. It just becomes an object on which anybody could act, whether it's a smaller real estate developer, a private residence, it can be a neighborhood group, but they only have so much power. And they're ultimately fighting the state. They have lost, once the Delta Land Company goes away, their main mode of organizing and the way that Maadi had been organized for 60 years is gone. And once you lose like your central mode of collaborating and organizing and lobbying, because that's how Maadi was. They did have to get certain permissions from the Egyptian government to do different things. They lose all of it. It's like losing an arm or a hand. Like, they don't have their method of acting.
يعني بالانتقال للوقت الحاضر، يعني ممكن نكون شفنا انه في حصل يعني زي تراجع في جودة الحياة من في المعادي من الستينات تحت ضغوط الحركة اللي اشرت لها، زي الكثافة السكانية وغياب نمط الإدارة اللي يقدر يحافظ على مستوى الجودة فيها من بعد تأميم الشركة. يعني ده ياخدنا بقى للحظة الحالية اللي هي فيها تحديات من نوع مختلف، ليها علاقة أكتر بالقلق من غياب المساحات الخضراء أو تقلصها، اللي هي كانت مكون أساسي في شخصية الحي، لأسباب برضو ممكن تكون مرتبطة بالكثافة السكانية. بس احنا في الحالة دي بنتكلم على التوسع في أعمال تطوير اللي هدفها تيسير الحركة المرورية أو التوسعات جوه الحي نفسه. هل احنا بنفقد شخصية المعادي بشكل تدريجي في الوقت الحالي؟
Certainly, I think the historic Maadi has been chipped away at, and further expansion of streets would mean the further erosion of that historical garden city. But the end of historical existence doesn't necessarily mean that the real Maadi doesn't exist. Ancient Rome is buried beneath modern Rome today, but is present day Rome somehow not real? Longtime residents have a deep attachment to the kind of Egypt they experienced in Maadi in the past. And I think perhaps the ideal approach to future development would start by acknowledging the historic town and building on it rather than tearing it down. But Cairo is under tremendous demographic pressure. So those who want to preserve Maadi will likely have a hard time making progress with their efforts if they fail to acknowledge the need for urban and suburban spaces to continually adapt and change. Like I kind of mentioned before, cities are living things, and they have to change to live. And this is always a debate when it comes to historical preservation, but cities to live can't also be museums. Like, we need spaces for preservation, for memory, for legacy. Those are very important parts of urban life. But you don't want to I do not think necessarily that human life thrives if you're living in a museum. And so the balance has to be struck between allowing that ongoing adaptation to happen. I would hope, though, again, ideally that comes out of a space that acknowledges Maadi's history and its beauty, and what that has meant to a lot of active Egyptian nationalists throughout its history. It really, for many, was a space that epitomized the beauty that Egypt could have. Because it seems like in some ways there's like a tension between those active for the preservation of Maadi and then a lot of other causes in which people are concerned about. I think one of the things that has largely driven a lot of the development and even some of the recent development of Cairo is this attempt to show like power over the deserts, control over nature. That's part of the reason why Heliopolis was developed, where it was to show the ability to use tram lines to develop the desert. And that kind of emphasis is continued. But I think part of the tension, and this happens in all sorts of cities, and in some ways the question is like, if the state is writing the laws, like what kind of development are they going to reward? And so some cities, like where I live in Birmingham now, they've rewarded a lot of historic preservation. So you can get more money to have a business in an old building that you repurpose than tearing it down and building a new one. Right? Like those kinds of rewards for different kinds of development allow the city to embrace a certain vision of itself. It just to like specifically in Maadi, I think part of the issue is that there's competing visions of what it's supposed to be. And so that something has to kind of get reconciled. So to me, again, I come back to like, if there could be a vision for what the preservation of certain spaces could look like, while acknowledging the need for better traffic patterns, there needs to be some sort of balancing, or there would hopefully be some sort of balancing.
شكرا جزيلا دكتورة أناليس، ونتمنى أن نلتقي في حوار جديد مع المنصة.